All right, we are back. Sorry to be a couple minutes late there, having a spirited conversation with some of the assembled 1,000 or so people in the Premium Basketball Awesemo.com Slack channel. So I guess we will, recap last night for a little bit as people file into the room. Went just about according to plan. I think I was a bit hesitant to be. I think I hopefully made it clear that it's a really tough spot for Portland in these playoffs, specifically with their injuries. But the matchup with Golden State, when everyone has a case of the tryhards, is a particularly difficult one for them. And I think I was a little bit hesitant with them having outperformed my expectations the first two rounds. But it's tough. There's not always a lot of hot takes in a short slate, especially a one-game slate. But yesterday went almost perfectly according to plan. I built a couple lineups which were basically off by a spot or two, depending if you rolled out Harkless or Hood or both. But advocated pretty hard in the chat all day for Steph and Clay as your starting points. It's a fine matchup for both of them, and when you take Durant out of there, it'll be more interesting when you get Durant back. I have him probably, I'm guessing, somewhere around Game 4 or Game 5, but again, that's just hopefully an educated guess at this point, but those two guys are going to carry a lot of water for this series until they come back. Generally, after that, I wanted to combine them with either McCollum or Lillard, depending on what site you were playing and how much value you had left, and on FanDuel, McCollum was better priced relative to Lillard. On DK, I preferred Lillard, and I suppose Lillard was still better, but they were both obviously quite bad. Tons of turnovers for this team. On DK, you wanted to have Cantor. We were just talking in the premium Slack chat. I don't think they can keep running Cantor out there for 30 whatever minutes against this team. It's just not going to work, especially in this system. In the systems that the Thunder had and that the Knicks had, there was a little more cover, and the supporting personnel was better able to support him. But especially with this team basically having to give up the ghost to a certain degree on the defensive side of the ball and playing more Rodney Hood. Although his defense, he's long and his defense has been better than I expected for this postseason. Not like Cantor, who deserves a lot of credit for, I think, playing at the highest level he can. He just has an impressive skill set when it comes to, he's a great post player, brilliant rebounder. Defense and handling guys in the pick and roll is tough for him, and the Warriors are particularly brilliant at getting those matchups and exploiting them. That's a really tough spot. So, similar to Mirotic, who we're going to talk about in a little bit, I do think his role gets reduced in this series because it's just sort of a question of who do you guard. Touching on today's game for a little bit first, who does Mirotic guard? He's got to guard Danny Green, right? Like, Brook Lopez is not going to successfully guard anybody but Marc Gasol in the starting lineup, right? Okay. Giannis is going to guard Pascal, almost certainly to start with, and that's fine. Chris Middleton is going to guard Kawhi. Eric Bledsoe is going to guard Kyle Lowry, and now the two players you have left in the starting lineup are Danny Green and Nikola Mirotic. And Green can guard Mirotic a lot better than Mirotic can guard Green. So with the advent of some brilliant bench options in the first couple rounds for this Bucks team, with George Hill being finally correctly implemented, Pat Connaughton playing better than I certainly thought he would and making himself a viable piece there, the omnipresent Ersan Ilyasova, and the returning from injury Malcolm Brogdon, I fear for Mirotic's minutes in this series. He's just in a particularly tough spot. There's obviously some things he does better as far as rebounding, but I imagine you see his minutes. We'll see, but that'll be my sort of, I guess, hot take for the series. And I like Mirotic a lot as a player. This team just doesn't need him, and in this particular matchup, I think it's going to be a little hard for him to stay on the floor. So much like Cantor, I don't know if that realization comes tonight and is actually effectuated here. But I have concerns with his ability to stay above 18 or 20 minutes in the series. And towards the end of the last series, he was getting 26, 27, 28 minutes. So it will be interesting to see how that goes. But perhaps as early tonight, I do expect to see him largely issued in favor of mostly Brogdon. But also, I think the team is better with Hill out there. The team's probably better with Connaughton out there, and I'd have to think long and hard about Ilyasova. But it's probably better with Ilyasova out there, too. You like what Mirotic does for you on the offensive end of the court a little bit relative to those players. But it's going to be a real concern on the other end of the court, and exactly how they align defensively is going to be interesting. Yeah, a couple other notes on last night. Again, I expected the Warriors to run a lot of guys and run them very few minutes. I talked for a little bit about how Kerr does the whole nobody plays more than 12 minutes type thing, but he runs a pile of guys, and it wasn't quite that deep. But basically, they played their big four guys, quite a number of minutes, counting Iguodala there. Bogut was very effective, but played 8.5 minutes starting, and you had between, I think it was 11 and 15 minutes of five guys who were Bell, Jerebko, McKinney, Livingston, and Cook. All played that many minutes, and that wasn't terribly shocking for me. So, close to having it perfect. Wanted to have Steph, wanted to have Clay. Preferred the Trailblazers' value to the Warriors' value for the reasons listed. Cantor on DK was pretty much a must. I do think his minutes are either going to fall off or they're going to get pretty consistently whooped here. And I don't blame them sticking with him to a certain extent. And I think he's trying his hardest, but yeah, it's going to be interesting to see where they go there. You can certainly argue that they just go all in with the, okay, we've got to try to outscore you strategy, which likely isn't going to happen either. This Warriors team is incredibly good defensively and don't really get enough credit for it and really cover passing lanes. And again, they had more than a dozen steals last night. It's a really tough spot. It won't be that bad. The Trailblazers will shoot better than that. The Warriors won't shoot quite that well. And again, this game was, within 10 points with 3 or 4 minutes to go. So it wasn't like it was a complete slaughter, but it's a really tough spot. I still think Portland gets one at home, but it's going to be interesting there. Harkless ended up being the guy over Aminu. I had that one wrong. I said I'd rather play Aminu in tournaments, but they went small a little bit more, which you can do against this current version of the Warriors. Again, you got 24 minutes of Looney off the bench, and he always gets that, 18 to 24 sort of towards the top of his range. But he always gets that 18 to 24 minutes. He is who we expected there. Yeah. So I'll be interested to see how fresh and attentive and focused in the Bucks are here. Again, they got a pretty big layoff between rounds 1 and rounds 2 after they waxed the Pistons. They certainly looked disengaged as they entered into the second round and got waxed by the Celtics at home in Game 1 of that series before obviously fixing things up, making a couple changes and getting there. They're again on somewhat of an extended break here. Alright, so these teams met 4 times in the regular season. The first one was, I remember, 2 weeks into the season, roughly. I think they were both 6-0 at the time, 7-0, but they were both undefeated, and it was a meeting of the East Powers, and, they announced at the beginning, Kawhi's going to miss it for rest, and then they said, Giannis is going to sit it out too then, so I was hoping to see those two guys playing against each other. I remember pretty clearly, and they eventually both sat out. So you had that first game of the season with neither of those guys there, which obviously changes everything around pretty significantly, but then had the 3 further meetings. And again, all this occurred prior to the additions to these teams. So you have no Mirotic on the Bucks, you have no Marc Gasol. So where to start? I suppose the most notable thing about these two teams playing each other was how much they stuck with the straight across guarding and players matching up with each other much more than you would expect. Now, the Raptors don't switch as much as almost any other team in the league, and the Bucks are pretty close to the bottom of the league as far as switching. They push through a whole lot of stuff, so you get some incredibly dense defensive numbers as far as matchups with guys guarding each other. And so, giving you an example, Kawhi Leonard again did not play that first game against the Bucks. Played the next 3. Over the course of those 3 games, his primary defender was Chris Middleton for 143 total possessions. Second place was Malcolm Brogdon with 25. That's an enormous share. If someone is guarded half their possessions, it's pretty rare, just due to all the switching, and rotations generally don't align, and so you're guarded some by the bench guys, and there's breaks get taken into that. So, if someone is guarded 40% by someone on the opposing team of the total possessions on the year, that's a pretty significant number. That's a little bit above average. You're looking at a situation here where Kawhi was guarded by Chris Middleton something like 65% of the time here. Again, Middleton guarded Kawhi 143 possessions over those 3 games. Brogdon second and 25. Sterling Brown third with 14. Giannis fourth with 12. 12 possessions over 3 full games against each other. 9 for Snell, 7 for Bledsoe, 6 for Hill, 5 for Lopez, 1 for DJ Wilson, and 1 for Ersan. So adding all those numbers up, that's 143 out of 223 possessions where Chris Middleton spent the most time. And again, these are using the Second Spectrum public numbers available on NBA.com. You can look up a player, hit stats, hit advanced stats, change profile to matchup, and you can look at all this stuff. You can add some filters, so you would set the period of time to the regular season, change per game to totals, and put in opposing team filter of Milwaukee, and all this is available. But that's an absolutely massive number, where 143 out of 223 possessions, it's like 2/3 of the time. That almost never happens, and it worked largely that way across the ball too. If you look at Giannis, in the 3 games he played, he was guarded by Pascal Siakam 93 possessions. The next highest was Kawhi with 31, which is a little bit more. And I do think that switch is a little more likely here. Middleton did a fairly good job on Kawhi, better than I would have expected. Certainly guys who are going to get a ton of time, and the matchup disparities are more difficult if they cross guard. So when you switch somebody onto Kawhi, it gets even more difficult for this team. So I do think, with the exception of the Mirotic wrinkle here, you continue to see a situation in which Kawhi is guarded really, really significantly by Chris Middleton as the primary defender, and Giannis is guarded really, really significantly by Pascal as the primary defender. I think that continues to be the case, and you end up with Brolo on Marc Gasol. Obviously, again, they did not play against each other on these 2 teams this year. They did play each other 2 games when they were on Milwaukee and Memphis, respectively. Unsurprisingly, it's a better spot for Marc Gasol. They got blown out in one of those games, but he was very effective. Was close to the leader, if not the leader, in fantasy points for the Grizzlies in both those games. But again, that wasn't particularly weird from him. But it's generally a good spot from him from an individual matchup. Now, both these guys are cheap. I would probably rather, certainly if they were the same price, play Marc Gasol than Brook Lopez. But again, he's just not that engaged. They're both capable of picking up a reasonable number of peripheral stats here. Brook Lopez can fall into some rebounds. Doesn't tend to. It's a team that doesn't offensively rebound much at all. And defensively gets dragged around a fair amount, and especially for men of his size, Brook Lopez isn't a terribly great rebounder, so those tend to be absent. But really, coming into his second decade in the league, has really picked up his ability to pick up some block shots. But if you're playing Brook Lopez, you're doing it for hopefully he gets open and just ends up bombing away for threes. But he's cheap enough and will be owned low enough that I think that he's appropriately priced to select in that endeavor. Marc Gasol just ends up sort of being a better version in that he's generally going to get more rebounds, he's generally going to get more assists, he's generally going to get more combined steals and blocks. He actually ranks pretty close to Brolo in blocks, but is going to pick up more steals, and generally is just a better defender, and just has a better matchup and can actually operate down low a little bit. So, certainly if they were the same price by any sort of raw points understanding, I would certainly prefer Marc Gasol in this spot. The concern with Marc Gasol is whether or not he is just significantly owned enough significantly enough just invested in the offense here. He's been, I would say, almost negatively deferential. Now, a lot of this has to do with God mode Kawhi playing at such a high level that everybody's deferring a little bit. You got, a nice game out of Pascal Siakam in Game 5, but Game 6 and Game 7, they were pretty bad, and he looked a little hesitant, but he also was just deferring to God mode Kawhi. It cannot be, overstated the fact that Kawhi took 39 shots, I believe it was, in Game 7 of that series, and certainly wasn't hesitant at any point. And, again, they won the series. I'm not sure if this necessarily was that much better a situation, with him constantly dealing with double teams, than, having a more balanced offense, trying to establish Gasol a little bit more, doing more pick and pop between him and getting Lowry more involved every game. I mean, that's a conversation you could have, but they got there at the end of the day. There's a number of questions with exactly how this series will go down. And again, another one starts with Mirotic here. He kind of has to guard Danny Green to start. And that works. Danny Green is a guy you can hide guys on. Now, he's more fleet of foot than Nikola Mirotic, can run him into some difficult situations. And I think it's more likely than not for that reason. And again, just the exceptional number of guys they have to replace him with, especially as Malcolm Brogdon becomes more healthy, that his minutes do take, a haircut here as this series goes on. But it's going to be interesting to see how that starts, how many switches to get him. Because, you're going to be able to get him. You're going to be able to get Kawhi isolated on him a few times, and that's probably not going to be a great look for him. And you'll have him chasing around Danny Green. I'm worried for Mirotic in this matchup. It isn't a spot where he can hide really as well as he needs to. Maybe. We've certainly had times, the entirety of the 76ers and Raptors series, one of the concerns was, could you keep J.J. Redick on the floor if he were the 76ers? Because he's a defensive liability. He doesn't have the size or the speed or some combination of both to match up with most of the guys on the other team. And they, as expected, hit him on Danny Green, and he did okay. He did enough where he didn't get embarrassingly played off the court. So, to what extent do the Raptors attempt to abuse this? To what extent do they attempt to scheme for it? I don't know. But I will say I do expect Mirotic's minutes to decrease. Even you could make an argument, setting aside scheme and principle and exactly how everything is executed, that the improvement of Malcolm Brogdon should put him out on the court anyway. And again, if you looked during the regular season and looked up, say, I don't know, Danny Green or Malcolm Brogdon, I think I have one of them pulled down here, you were going to see, again, a pretty significant chunk of their time spent guarding the direct opposition. So, for example, Brogdon in the regular season played all 4 games. Danny Green played all 4 games. Danny Green guarded him 68 possessions. Next most was Norman Powell at 46. Next one after that was Fred VanVleet at 32. I don't have any particular order here. I'm just going to sort of stream of consciousness this. I got about 5 pages of notes, but people having any questions, again, if you're in the premium Slack chat, go ahead and fire them at me there. If you are not, hit me up with a message or a tweet on the Twitter sphere. Again, we've given ourselves quite a bit of time. We've got about 40 minutes left to discuss this this matchup. So as far as the bench goes there, I would feel much more confident in Fred VanVleet than Norman Powell for a couple of reasons, but mostly because VanVleet can't handle a couple of the matchups in the backcourt. Defensively, spells positions they need a little bit more. Powell hasn't looked good, and I just don't think really has the trust at this point, especially once you get, in theory, OG Anunoby back. He's a better fit for a lot of what this team wants to do at this point. So I would be generally more inclined and more excited to play Fred VanVleet than Norman Powell. Generally, as far as looking at the the slates tonight. I believe, much like yesterday, I didn't think you really needed to overthink it, and you should start with Steph and Clay. Then after that, I probably would have played Lillard on DK, maybe McCollum on FanDuel, and that would have been wrong. You actually wanted Draymond in those spots. Best lineup both sites was basically, and I said my favorite order on the Warriors was Steph and then Clay and then Draymond well before the other guys, and your best lineup was those three guys and then Trailblazers value. That was obvious. I don't think that was a hot take whatsoever. I guess it would have been a hot take to say play 3 Warriors studs before playing McCollum or Lillard, and I most certainly did not say that, and that was going to be your best lineup. But I think it's... How do I explain this? There's an appropriate value given in the community to being contrarian, to looking at a situation and go like, oh, a lot of people are going to zig, I'm going to zag. In the long term, that's going to make you more money than just doing the obvious thing, because the most obvious thing is usually fairly well owned. So as opposed to yesterday banking the shit out of it and playing that unique lineup and winning 10, 20, 50, $100,000, if the lineup as discussed with Steph, Clay, Lillard, Cantor, Guy comes in and hits, you end up making $427 because the top prize splits 170 ways. But I do think that is in all things there is an equilibrium, and there is a point at which you are just being, for lack of a better term, what we will call too cute. And getting far away from Giannis or Kawhi, some combination of the two, is probably too cute tonight. I think you can have an interesting conversation. We talked on FanDuel about how I imagine the captaincy spot will be more heavily owned than Giannis, perhaps, than it should be versus Kawhi. I like Giannis more than Kawhi. I just redid everything a little while ago. I have them both in the mid-50s, but I have Giannis about 3.5 points higher than Kawhi for a number of reasons we can get into here. I have minutes concerns. I do have Kawhi for a couple more minutes. There are matchup considerations here, but I do have Giannis as the top scorer on the day. I have Kawhi and Steph Curry for what it's worth, and those of you looking at 2-game slate, almost exactly tied around 53, 54 fantasy points looking at this slate. But I think on FanDuel, and this sounds crazy, but especially with the additional $2,000 you spend on Giannis instead of Kawhi, I think I would probably rather I would rather run Kawhi in my MVP, I believe it's called, spot there than Giannis for the ownership differential. And again, that's, in my opinion, not being too cute. That's finding a correct mathematical edge. I think running a captain other than those two guys is probably being too cute. Who do you think outscores both of them tonight, in all honesty? You know what I'm saying? Some significant number of, especially on FanDuel, where you're not talking about extra salary. DraftKings is a different, kettle of fish. If you go, I think Kyle Lowry is just too cheap, I'm going to run him out there as captain so I don't have to play any bad value, and I think he plays off his proportion best, and neither Kawhi nor Giannis go nuts, and I think that could be the best lineup. Cool. I think that's reasonable. FanDuel, some 10-20% of lineups are going to have players not named Giannis or Kawhi in the MVP spot. That's probably too cute for me. It's going to be something I would think under 5% of the time where one of those two guys isn't the highest scoring player on this slate. They both have reasonable matchups. Both teams, in my opinion, generally have a lack of intention to do much double teaming in this matchup. To start, there's going to be a lot of feeling out in this game. One other, I do think there's really a couple of interesting spots to attack here. If I'm Nick Nurse, I'd be really curious how much you really direct your offense towards trying to get, Mirotic switched on to Kawhi, things of that nature. So I'm really curious to watch this first game, and much like tomorrow's show where we discuss Game 2 of the Western Conference Finals, after watching this game. Game 2s tend to be a pretty sweet spot. Both Game 1 and Game 2 are pretty brilliant. Game 1, people misplay because they go with the regular season, or in this case, the last playoff series, and they issue some better plays. So, round 2 where it became much more of a Middleton spot than a Bledsoe spot. And there were just similar situations on all the teams where, Paul Millsap was dreadful in round 1, and just, you knew he was going to be under-owned going into round 2, and it was a great, great spot for him, and he was brilliant the entire series. So Game 1s of series. You get to beat up on people for using not terribly appropriate sample sizes and looking at the wrong series of the regular season, and then in Game 2 you get to beat up on people who overreact to Game 1. When you get late in the series, Game 5, Game 6, Game 7, things tend to normalize, and the guys who should produce by that point tend to have produced, and it's a little harder to find the edges. But Game 1 and Game 2 of playoff series, in my experience, and having spoken to a lot of people about it, tend to be pretty profitable opportunities. That being said, I don't see any great disparity here, except to say I do think I would over-own the studs. The number of ways in my mind in which they are productive and pay off those salaries significantly exceeds the number of ways in which they are not. Let's delve into that a little deeper now. If I look at the Bucks, there is no one I look at as a particularly tough matchup for Giannis. He was perfectly productive in all the games this series, again with Pascal as his primary defender. There is some guesswork here. Either or both teams can choose to focus the shit out of the opposing monster. You could deal with, all right, we're going to constantly double Giannis, and that immediately makes him a significantly less impressive option, and immediately makes George Hill and Eric Bledsoe and Chris Middleton and all these other guys much more impressive options. That is obviously possible to a certain extent. How long and when, if at all, do they put Kawhi on Giannis, and or vice versa? I think Kawhi on Giannis is much more likely than Giannis on Kawhi. The matchup is a little bit better. There's fewer holes in that system. The other guys are able to cover it a little better. So I think Kawhi guarding Giannis as a primary defender will happen for stretches this series, and I think the occurrence of that is well more likely than the converse. But, looking at the Bucks, you have, so talking about this team, you have Brook Lopez, and not a particularly great matchup, sharing time with Mirotic at the 5, and Ersan at the 5, and Giannis at the 5. You doubt the minutes are too high. I have him for 27 right now. That could come down. There are real issues with having him out there and Mirotic out there for a while. I expect an early substitution in this game, because that's going to get sticky. Like, I'll go out on a limb and say Toronto starts off this game hot. Like, if I could bet the first quarter, I'd bet Toronto. If I could bet the game, I'd bet the under, by the way. I think the over-under is a little more juiced than I would like it to be. Again, you had 4 games this year. The first one, neither Kawhi nor Giannis played, so I think we can safely set that aside. Of the other 3 games, we had 2 that were really low scoring. I want to say one was 199 points and another one was 203. Now, those are both under 50th percentile outcomes as far as score goes. But I would put the over-under around 211, 212. I think it's sitting at like 218. Mirotic is a concern there, but I do expect this to pace down a little bit. And again, the addition of Marc Gasol relative to Ibaka is going to hurt your pace a little bit. Playoff time, playoff defense, playoff minutes. Again, we've seen some historically low-paced series so far in these playoffs. So for me, I think that number is a little bit high. So probably if I'm placing a bet tonight, it would be on the under in this game. We should be 6-1 in the postseason. When I got dead wrong, we ended up 5-2 when we took the under on the Denver-Portland game. That was under through regulation and under through an overtime, but in the second of the 4 overtimes, got to the over. So I didn't actually bet it, but if I had, I imagine that would have tilted me a little bit. But all right, so let's talk about... But anyhow, my point was, if you're looking at Bucks other than Giannis to be the guy here, because again, I was advocating for over-owning these guys if possible, or at least putting them in the higher spots, paying the salary. Who's going to be the guy to get there? Brook Lopez? It could happen, but again, this isn't a Raptors team that tends to give up a ton of threes. Marc Gasol is a perfectly equitable defender in this type of situation. And again, I think the concern on defense is really relevant. I'm not sure how much time he gets, so okay, I don't really want to vote for him to be the guy to get there. What about Eric Bledsoe? It's a decent spot for Bledsoe, not a good one by any means, and he's with the emergence of George Hill and the return of Malcolm Brogdon. Him seeing 27, 28 minutes in the playoffs doesn't seem likely to increase, and he's not that cheap, so okay, I don't think he's going to be the guy. Talking about Chris Middleton, I really like Chris Middleton as a player. Not a good spot for him, and I do expect Kawhi to guard him the majority of the time, maybe 50%, maybe 80%. That's tough, and you saw that reflected in the number of shots you got out of him during the regular season in those 4 games. They played 4 games. Again, in the first time, nobody relevant played, so we're just going to ignore that game in its entirety. If you look at the second game of the series, they started their number of starters. Brogdon took 15 shots. Brook Lopez took 13 shots. Eric Bledsoe took 14 shots. Giannis Antetokounmpo took 15 shots. Chris Middleton took 9. Had 30 fantasy points, which is just fine. Yeah, picked up some peripherals. I don't think Chris Middleton is unplayable on a 1-game slate. I don't think he's a bust, but I do think he's got the toughest individual matchup on the team, and hypothetically in the league, I imagine his usage comes down a little bit. In that game, he shot 3 of 9 and got about 30 fantasy points. And the next game, he shot 6 of 13. Now, again, Giannis took 25 shots in that game, but he shot 6 of 13, had 32.5 fantasy points. Okay, that's pretty decent. In the next game, he took 9 shots again, and shot 7 of 9, which is really functional. I don't know how many of those were directly on Kawhi, and I'm not going to take the time to look it up because it's not terribly relevant. But the point being, of those 3 subsequent games, he took 9 shots in 2 of them, which, again, shouldn't be terribly surprising. You're going to have guys better in what, again, not a ton of switching relative to other teams. You're going to get a lot of one-on-one matchups that sustain through the game. So I don't really like, Chris Middleton to get there. Brogdon's playing with limited minutes. Obviously, he's cheap. George Hill's playing with limited minutes. Obviously, he's cheap. Who knows how much Pat Connaughton gets? You can always Ersan, who, unlike Mirotic, has some issues on defense as far as being fleet of foot, but is actually a very, very good team. There's a lot of nice, I know how to take charges guys in this series. Like, if you like people playing quality defense and taking a charge, Kyle Lowry and Ersan Ilyasova has something to show you. Those guys will be standing in the right place at the right time. So again, that was talking about every member of the Bucks by extension of saying one of them getting there seems more likely than Giannis, who's going to get largely one-on-one coverage, just going out and putting his thing down and getting her done. I think certainly on FanDuel, again, where you're not paying extra price, having MVPs other than those 2 guys seems too cute to me. Now, again, that involves some prognostication and prestidigitation on my part, not knowing exactly what the ownership is going to be. There is, again, a point of equilibrium. If Giannis and Kawhi are 96% of the MVPs, I'd probably favor going somewhere else then. Then I can see going with pick guy. If they are, 90%, I'd probably suck down and then just be like, hey, sweet, those 10% of people are quite possibly paying the rake, because I'd be pretty surprised if those guys didn't get there. And the same thing, if you want to talk about the Raptors, Danny Green is Danny Green. Marc Gasol doesn't look terribly interested. Pascal Siakam is going to be dealing with a ton of Giannis defense, who, again, if you're putting a list on one hand of the best defenders in the league, Giannis and Kawhi are going to be on there, so not an ideal spot for him. Kyle Lowry has been generally disengaged this entire year when Kawhi Leonard is going, and that leaves Kawhi Leonard. So what's the most, significantly the most likely thing to happen is Kawhi, again, going out and dominating some fools. Let's see, other things to talk about. I'll take a look at some notes here and see if I've missed anything significant. I'll start handling some questions in a few minutes. But certainly, again, yesterday was fairly obvious that it was going to be, all right, Bogut's not going to do a ton offensively. Iguodala was still too expensive at that point. He's not going to do a ton offensively. Again, Draymond is, a guy who's not going to be calling his own shot a lot, and you have 2 of the best shooters in the world against a Portland team that, again, has overperformed and just isn't terribly good defensively. I don't know how to put it other than that. Those guys are going to go out and do some damage. Similarly, it just makes the most sense that Kawhi and Giannis are going to perform. And again, I got all the way through this conversation in lieu of talking about at the beginning. I can see playing Kawhi at your captain on FanDuel, or as your MVP on FanDuel, as not being too cute, because I think there's people like to be efficient. So that's the same reason that in general, leaving money on the table is a profitable strategy. Setting aside ownership and people's psychological tendencies, it's not a great idea. Frequently, and again, the correlation between how smart it is to do this would go up and would be directly correlated with the number of games on the slate. But the fewer the games are on a slate, the more leaving money on the table makes sense, just because people don't like to do it. It's like when you're a 10-year-old and you get $20 for your birthday and you go to Toys R Us and you're out there. Well, pour one out for Toys R Us, but you go to some place where you can purchase things, GameStop, and they give you got $50 and you buy one game and it's $45 counting tax. You're looking around for a way to spend those $5. You're like, oh shit, I'll take a gumball and this whatever the hell, and I don't know, some amiibo for my wheel. Like, you're literally trying to spend every goddamn cent. It's a pretty normal impulse, and I think there's a similar impulse in that you're like, oh, spending 18 grand on Giannis, not 16 grand on Kawhi. I think I'm going to make Giannis my captain. Now again, I have Giannis projected to score more points. Cash, I'd have Giannis as my MVP. But in tournaments, I think Kawhi outscores Giannis somewhere in the range of 40% of the time, give or take a few percent either way. And I imagine the positioning of them at the 1 and the 2, at the MVP and the, I think, All-Star is the second tier designation, makes it more beneficial to flop them. I think that's probably not being too cute. But again, I am supposing some number of facts not in evidence there, but just sort of talking through all the various decisions and the game theory you're making here. And that isn't to say you can't play a guy at MVP on FanDuel who isn't those two players. It's just a question whether or not that would be incentivized over time. And I don't know if you can get that information anywhere. If somebody gets a second, send me a message saying, yes, there is a way to see what percentage a guy is owned at captain on FanDuel. I know you can do it, at MVP on FanDuel. I know you can do it on DraftKings, but I don't think that information is available anywhere on FanDuel. Feel free to confirm or deny to me via message. All right, we got some 20 minutes left there. What are your thoughts on Brogdon? What are your projections? Yeah, I don't know in a game. This is the big time. This is, you're into the Eastern Conference Finals now. So, I haven't gotten or been able to find any really specific updates as to the level of his conditioning. He seems fine. I'm shocked if he gets beyond 25, 26 minutes. But if you asked me to put the over-under on the game he starts, I would have it at 2.5. I'd be really surprised if he isn't starting by game 3. And I wouldn't be surprised if he started game 2. It's going to be in there. Again, I like a lot of the things Miro does as a player. But I don't think this situation fits him. Do I see any significant minutes changes for any of the primary players on either team as this series starts? Again, Mirotic, I've alluded to a few times, I think comes down a little bit here. It's going to be really interesting. Someone is going to have to lose some minutes here. I imagine Sterling Brown stays pretty much just right the hell out of things. You could lose time on Bledsoe. You shouldn't lose much time on Middleton. You shouldn't lose much time on Giannis. Although it's worth pointing out, with these games coming every day, now they're coming off a big rest, but some of the really sick minutes loads we saw, seeing the 45s and 46s at the end of the second round, probably going to get dialed back a hair for the first few games of this series. Schedule getting a little tighter again. Again, most teams playing every other day. I wouldn't be surprised to see that come down a little bit for a couple of games, but not absurdly so. But I do think over the course of the series, certainly for the Bucks, you see more Brogdon and less Mirotic, I think, being the most immediate translation. And yeah, there's a real question who gets the haircut for this team. Again, I think Mirotic is the most obvious one for me. That just makes sense, and I do think Brogdon getting more time is likely and should be the case. He was really exceptional this year and just does a lot for this team. So I imagine that... I really don't know if they will give more time to Hill or Connaughton in this series. They should give more time to George Hill. Now, Connaughton does a couple of things. He makes up for a couple of other weak rebounders in Mirotic sometimes, certainly Brook Lopez. Connaughton, for a guy of his size playing out on the ring, vacuumed rebounds in this postseason. Some of that was kind of crazy luck. I remember watching a 10-minute segment of one of the games in round 2 and just being like, dude, every single ball bounces to this guy. Like, if you read the internet over the last few days, you see the magnetic rim theories with Kawhi's basketball as far as conspiracy theories. If there were magnets in the ball and in Pat Connaughton's hands, I wouldn't have been surprised because the ball bounced to that guy a lot. So I think they should play a little more Hill. I've thought that for a while, and more frequently they played a little more Connaughton. I really don't know. I expect you see pretty consistent minutes for Middleton, pretty consistent minutes for Giannis. Then it's going to be really interesting to see how the Bledsoe-Hill split goes and how much time they spend next to each other, and who loses the minutes as Brogdon comes on. I have some guesses, and I can tell you what I would do, but I really don't know, and it's going to really depend a lot on how this evolves. Saying Lopez isn't a good rebounder is just wrong. His job isn't to rebound, it's to box out so Giannis and guards can get them. He's damn good at boxing out. I think damn good is a bit high praise, but I agree that I assigned responsibility poorly, so I'll rephrase. Brook Lopez doesn't tend to get a lot of rebounds. So you're right, saying he's not a good rebounder is a bit of an oversimplification. He always, even when he was playing more traditional center and before really developing his three-point shot, for a guy of his size, is not a good rebounder. I will stand by that. But he's not a dreadful rebounder, and if he played a more traditional center role and stayed down low, he'd be able to average 10 a game or some such. So I'll agree that a lot of the reasons he doesn't get rebounds is systemic and has to do with the team he's playing on, and the fact that they really go back in transition defense. The Bucks are an underrated defense also, and they really don't hunt offensive rebounds, and that's costing them a couple of games. So I will agree with you that it has more to do with the system than any specific deficiencies in Brolo's game. So that's a fair point. Hill or Connaughton on DK. I'll take a look at their prices and see if there's a disparity. I don't remember particularly. I would probably be a little more inclined towards Hill between the two right now, but I would have them pretty close. You're saving $600 there too, and I imagine the ownership's a touch lower, so I would probably go with George Hill. Thoughts on Surge? Yeah, I expect them to run probably a little deeper, but a pretty similar rotation to what we saw in Game 7, where they're at least relying heavily on 7 guys, being the 5 starters, Ibaka and Van Vliet. I'm sure those guys will get time. I imagine you get an 8th guy in the primary lineup, probably Norm Powell, but I do think he's getting the fewest minutes substantially. I still have 28 minutes for Surge. This is a team in which you can go big against. Surge does have both a decent matchup on the offensive side, where he was very productive this year against the Bucks, which isn't surprising. Many centers were. But can be another hand to guard Giannis. You have outs where you just get more Ibaka because you get foul trouble on Pascal Siakam from guarding a ton of Giannis. Like, Giannis is obviously a big load to carry. So I do think Ibaka maintains a significant role in this matchup. Thank you for reminding me. That's obviously significant to say. But I still like Ibaka, and I still think he's cheap enough to work. Do you like Bledsoe at $5,500 on FanDuel? Again, the showdown slates, I tend to do a worse job of memorizing the pricing. So let me go specifically look at everybody's number and talk about it. But I have a feeling that is a 2-day designation because I don't think anyone's under 6,000. Yeah. So looking at the showdown slate, for reference, I do like him at $10,500. Like, I'm more excited about that than Kyle Lowry at 12 or Middleton at 12.5 or Pascal at 13.5 or Marc Gasol at 10. So I like Bledsoe quite a bit at his single game price on FanDuel. Where, again, especially when you limit his minutes, he's a very, very good defender. One of the things, if you go back through these series, George Hill is known to a certain degree for his defense. Bledsoe has been by far the better defender against almost everyone they've both matched up specifically. Let me find the 2-day slates with their $6,000 in prizes. Don't break the bank. And let me look at the point guards available. Because you were nice enough to ask the question, and you're in the premium Slack, so you get an answer from me. Yeah, the answer is certainly yes. I like him quite a bit. Again, looking at this pricing, you have Steph at 95. I think that's really good. You have Lillard at 93. By any raw point sensibility, I still vastly prefer Steph in that context. You have Lowry at 69, which is fine. But then you have Bledsoe at 55, where I think he's still staying in his high 20s role, and the upside is there. And again, that's a really significant discount. So yes, on that 2-game slate, I like Bledsoe. Again, the point guards, he'd probably be my favorite point guard after Steph. I'd probably rank my point guards, my first look at this slate, probably Curry, Bledsoe, Lillard, Lowry, Van Vliet at minimum. Mark Festins. Thoughts on Marc Gasol in the captain spot? I'd need to spend more time tinkering with it to be able to give you an exact impression, but it's whether or not it's saving you from having to make any plays that you're really unhappy with. Like, when you do that, you get to not play some of what's the cheaper value. So you get to not play, I imagine, $1,800 Fred Van Vliet will have some ownership, and $1,400 Norm Powell, and maybe some people will play, I don't know, Tony Snell, but it's just going to make the rest of your lineup significantly better. I'm sure it's not bad, but I'd really need to tinker with it to figure out whether or not I thought it was worth it. Again, DK, that's very interesting for me. So offhand, it sounds fine, but I'd really need to toy with it and really, figure out what I'm getting and what I'm losing by making that change. Do you think the Blazers go small with a Dame, CJ, Hood, Turner, Seth, Harkless, Aminu lineup? Oh, I understand what you're saying. No, if they move someone else to start at center, it'll be Zach Collins, I would think. You're liking Brogdon at captain. That's fine. You're hoping he gets 28 minutes, not 21 minutes. But that wouldn't surprise me at all. So, yeah, I'm fine with that. Middleton or Siakam on DK. Again, these are two guys who are, A, going to be expending a lot of energy on the defensive end of the court, and B, be dealing with really, really elite defenders. If I have to play one of those two guys, I would play Pascal Siakam. I think the switch is a little more likely. I think his ability to accrue fantasy points is less centralized on scoring. I think his shot total is more likely to stay up than Middleton. So if I have to play one of those guys, I will play Pascal Siakam. Who's your favorite DK captain? Raw points, it's going to be Giannis Antetokounmpo. Tournaments, again, I think you might be advantaged by switching it to Kawhi. But I would probably pretty heavily rely on those guys. Sorry if you mentioned it. Thoughts of Middleton on FanDuel. Worried about him having to guard Kawhi or get guarded by him. He will guard Kawhi and he will be guarded by him. Or I'd be really surprised. There is obviously some possibility, and again, I've been scouring as much as I can, that one of these teams employs a drastically different system than they did in the regular season. I have no reason to particularly believe that. So, yeah, I'm really worried about Middleton for that reason. He's going to have to expend a ton of energy on the defensive end of the court. Would you play Hill and Connaughton in the same showdown for DK, loading studs in there? I'd try not to. I'm not surprised if one of them only gets, 14 minutes. So I don't think it's undoable. Obviously, they could get 20 and 22 minutes and score 24 and 26 fantasy points. The value doesn't have to be good. It just has to be the best value. Look at yesterday. Harkless was legitimately pretty good. Hood was okay. But the best lineups had, Harkless and Hood in them, and it wasn't because they put up 40. Again, on DK, you would have Cantor in there, but that was sort of an auto play and pretty obvious. Any love for Bledsoe? Yes, generally I like Bledsoe at his price. Probably my second favorite buck. Again, it's price determined. Some places I can see going Brogdon first, but I like Bledsoe in general, yeah. Who makes the biggest leap production-wise from the semifinals? Not sure exactly what that means. Brolo minutes should be somewhat close to Gasol's, right? Or do you see a decrease in Gasol minutes? I think probably they both see a little fewer minutes than they saw in the last series. Again, Gasol was basically bought for what he did, which was to limit Embiid, and they did a brilliant job at that. They don't need him to do that so much here. so they can take a little off him so you don't have to run 36, 38, 40 minutes. You can keep him a little fresher. He's a little better in the time he is on the court. So I would actually think that both Brook Lopez, again, due to the fact that the Bucks just have more dudes now, and Mirotic on Giannis at the 5 is going to happen some. I think both I think both Lopez and Gasol will see fewer minutes this series on average than they did last series. Make sure you guys don't fade Serge Ibaka tonight. Yeah, I like Ibaka. I don't think he's a must-play, but I think I would want to be over the field there. I'm fine with that. For the 2-game slates, Dame and Curry seem to be the better price options versus Leonard and Giannis. Is this true for you as well? Let me know what site you're looking at there, FCL. Your thoughts on Van Vliet? I like him at $1,800. I think he gets 20 minutes. Obviously, there's a perilously low floor, but it's a 1-game slate. What do you want? George Hill and Gasol. Which Gasol? It's just a joke. Pal's not there. George Hill and Gasol, or Danny Green and Mirotic, or Iguodala for Yahoo Cash. I would play Iguodala over Mirotic for cash pretty convincingly. Tournaments, you have an interesting question there. I would play Iguodala over him. So my question becomes Iguodala or Green or George Hill and Gasol for cash. I would probably play Green and Iguodala, but that's very close. Thoughts on Ibaka? He's crushed them in the past. Yeah, it does not mean a ton. Again, he's going to come off the bench here. The minutes are more he's absolutely fun to play. Again, I still have him in the high 20s. I like him, but there's a minutes for you have to be concerned about. This game can go small a little bit, but generally I'm more bullish on Ibaka. There's a lot of ways he gets the minutes, foul trouble, etc. But the whole he dominated them is almost irrelevant. Again, you have to be careful with game logs, but he was starting, now he's coming off the bench. He was playing entirely the 5, now he's going to play some time at the 4. It's really a different kettle of fish. If you had to choose of the 3 on DK, would you take Gasol, Ibaka, or Brogdon for utility on Showdown? I'd probably still take Marc Gasol, but I would have them in that order. I would probably just from raw points, or really wanting them in tournaments, Gasol, then Ibaka, then Brogdon. Questions. Gasol, Hill, or Pat on FanDuel? That'd be Gasol for me pretty convincingly. Ibaka previously crushed them as the starter. Do you think the smarter move may be to go with Gasol in this case? I like Gasol more from a raw point sensibility than Ibaka. Yes. Lowry or Lowry if Bledsoe. Let's try one more time. Lowry or Bledsoe if Price isn't an option. Only took 3 tries. I would have to stick with Kyle Lowry. Would you advise not to have Kawhi and Giannis both on FanDuel? No, generally I think I would want them both. With their whole price multiplier without extra salary, that seems to be the best thing. Do you think the difference between Lopez and George Hill is over or under 6? I have it under 6. I think I have Brook Lopez at 4.5 points more than George Hill. Pat Connaughton or Hill raw points on DK. I have them almost identical, and again, I'm not terribly comfortable with it. I really don't know how the minutes are going to play out here. Because of what I expected the ownership, I slightly prefer playing George Hill, but with very little confidence. Ibaka or Gasol, I'm still going to play Gasol. It's not terribly close to me. If you think Gasol gets a few less minutes, does that mean you like Ibaka to get more? No, not particularly. I think Ibaka probably also gets less. You realize by the end of, then the second half of the series, they started rolling him out more and more as they just gave up on Norman Powell and gave up on, on Fred VanVleet for large stretches of that series. So versus the entire series, I imagine Gasol loses a few, simply because, again, you don't need him out there 38 minutes just sitting on, Embiid a ton. But I expect them to run a little deeper. Not as deep as the Warriors, who have an easier matchup and a deeper bench, and I don't expect them to thin it out that much. Which again, the Warriors did in regulation, not just in blowout time. How many real points do you have Pascal projected for? I will take a look. If I can find it. I think I have him at 19. 19 and a quarter. Question still coming in. For the 2-game slates, Dame and Curry seem better. Alright. So DraftKings prices on those pay-up guys on the 2-game slate. We'll take a look at that, and then that'll be our final question, and we will go into the tank. and look at some upcoming options. About 2.5 minutes to go. So I'm looking for the 2-game slate. Assuming it's here somewhere. Here it is. Oof. Such big prize pools. You shouldn't have. So you're asking me to compare the expensive options on this slate. Yeah, I mean, I have Curry and Kawhi projected almost identically, and Giannis a few points ahead. So I don't think it's a massive difference. But I would have Curry as the best priced from points per dollar to answer your question. Yes, I am about the same as Kawhi again, and he's $800 less. I have him only a few points less than Giannis, and he's $1,800 or $1,100 less. And then I would have Lillard pretty much in line with Giannis and Leonard as far as expected production. All right, 90 seconds, everybody. Let's get in it to win it. And again, would be pretty weird to get any sort of actionable news at this particular juncture. But seeing what we got. Wow, the main event on DK will not overlay, but it's going to rake somewhere to the order of 9% as opposed to the 16 it should. So that's certainly good, but it's going to take in about 600K and pay out about 555. So it's going to rake well less than you would than they would like it to rake. So certainly not what I would consider. It is not overlay. It's got nothing to do with what I consider, but that will not fill, which is unfortunate for wanting them to keep running out big tournaments. But it's a win-win. Either stuff overlays or doesn't fill, or they keep running out giant tournaments where we keep getting $500,000 tournaments on 1 and 2 game slates, which is pretty juicy too. So it's a win-win. But the win today will be that those contests will not entirely fill. Not really any significant overlay anywhere on FanDuel, however, that I see anyway. Some of the satellites, as always, not filling up. I think we're there. Hey, we're there. Okay. So let's take a second and look at some ownership. Again, nobody ever got back to me. I'm assuming that there is not any sort of appropriate way to figure out how owned someone is at each price on FanDuel. At each tier, rather. Like what percentage of guys' ownership is at MVP. I don't think we actually got that information. Good. I am glad you enjoyed the show. I did too. Felt good. There was no crazy, insane dog going apeshit the entire show like yesterday, which makes things a little more difficult. So, okay, let's take a look at, we'll get some FanDuel ownership real quick. $350,000 shot, which again, filled, which hard to argue about because DK didn't, so I guess you get credit for being a little more conservative. Kawhi, 74%, Giannis, 80%. Yeah, I'm a little more excited about the fact that a quarter of teams didn't roster Kawhi. Though I guess if you have to let one go, that's about the right spot. Those numbers don't do a ton for me. Bledsoe at 31%. Feels good. Brolo, 44. Danny Green, 21. Pascal Siakam, 32. Feels pretty good. Marc Gasol, 30. Feels pretty good. Mirotic, 33. I would have come in under that. Again, just a guy I can... Nothing wrong with it, but I can see that not working out. Norman Powell, 4.5. Fred VanVleet, 16. Brogdon, 18%. Although at 9,000, you were taking him. He was well more expensive than Brolo and Danny Green and some guys. So again, there were obviously players on both sides who were priced a little more equitably, and some were priced a little more advantageously. Serge Ibaka, 37%. Right. That's fine. Not as low as I think we collectively were hoping. Let's take a look on DraftKings real quick. What do we got? There's 555K. Yeah, there it was. And again, didn't quite fill. How can I tell what the entry fee was on this thing? Each entry is winning $18.60. Imagine a $20 entry fee. How the heck do I? I'll look in here. $20, yeah. So your $20 was worth $18.60, which is better normally than you're paying in rake by quite a bit. So little again, it usually gets incorrectly called overlay, but some underfill, I guess we'll call it, coining terms, on DK for their main event today. So that's nice. Loading up their ownership now. But looking at the lineup, I'm seeing Giannis 93, Kawhi 88. Yeah. Bledsoe 25. I'd be really happy about that. Aha, no, it's finally loading. Okay, so I'll just get the download. Yeah, I mean, hopefully you are enjoying yourself, not just watching the show, but in actually playing DFS. There are days where I feel like either there's a little overlay or underfill, as in today, or people are just doing something really stupid that it's still advantageous. But when you get into one-game slates, it would be difficult for me to argue that it's a great ROI play to be out there betting half your bankroll. Like, you need a certain amount of edge whenever you do this to overcome the rake. If you're going to put out $1 and collectively the field gets 85 cents back, you need to find a way to make up that 15%. And the fewer and fewer games and action points, the more difficult that comes to do. So certainly, hopefully you're enjoying yourself, because the edge, if present even for the very best of you, is nominal at this point. Ownership, number 1, Giannis Antetokounmpo, 93%. Cool. Number 2, Kawhi Leonard, 88%. Cool. Number 3, Pascal Siakam, 57.7%. I suspect I would have less than that. I don't know, and I don't recall his price offhand. He was a little more advantageous on DK, if I remember correctly. But again, going to see a metric ton of Giannis, that can lead to foul trouble. Less guaranteed to get there, able replacement in Ibaka if necessary. I imagine I would come in under that 57%. Middleton, 39. Again, I imagine I would come in under that. Mirotic, 38. I know I'd come under that. Connaughton, 37.5. Hill, 34.2. Again, yeah, all this ownership chunking into the mid-30s here for all these bench guys. You have Mirotic, Connaughton, Hill, and Ibaka between 33 and 38%. Lowry, 32. Probably want a little more than that, but that feels fine. Brook Lopez, 25. Sure. Eric Bledsoe, 25. Yeah, again, I'd be, probably my favorite ownership here is the 25% Bledsoe on both sides. There's a real floor, A, because he can play badly, combined with B, because it isn't the best matchup. C, there's any number of guys angling for his minutes from Hill and Brogdon and so on. But he can get going and randomly get 32 minutes and score 45, 50 fantasy points. Like, that's really possible, and his price was low enough combined with the upside and 25% ownership on a one-game slate. I'd be pretty happy about having being over that with Bledsoe. Rolo also 25. Marc Gasol 24. Again, that feels pretty good. The upside is there. Again, it's unlikely just because it's not that engaged on the offensive end of the court. But, if God mode Kawhi starts deferring more, you're going to get, Gasol and Lowry and Siakam having those games. Ersan, 21.5. It's fine. He's cheap. Van Vliet, 18%. That's fine. He's cheap. It was, I think my favorite play under like $3,000 on DK. So I hesitantly think he holds on to his 20 minutes in this game. We'll see. Danny Green, 15%. I would want a lot more than that. There is a real chance that he gets guarded by Mirotic for a long period of time. And again, I'm about to tab over and start watching that game. But yeah, I think you could get the 30-point Danny Green game here. And again, single game, 15%. Brogdon, 13%. Yeah, I thought it was going to be fairly low. The price wasn't that great. I had people talking about him as, I think he's going to be chalk today. I didn't, and I'd want more than 13%, so that feels good. Norman Powell, 4.3, sure. Sterling Brown, 0.9, okay. Tony Snell, 0.14, Jeremy Lin, 0.14, Jody Meeks, 0.08, Tim Frazier, 0.08, Malcolm Miller, 0.06, Bonzi Colson, 0.04, Chris Boucher, 0.01, Eric Merlin, 0.01, DJ Wilson, 0.01, Pat McCaw, 0.01. I believe, congratulations, you played yourself. I don't think he is actually available today. I know that was up in the air for a little while. doesn't matter much. Anyhow, we're 3 minutes into this game. I am going to go watch it. Thus far, Kawhi has done nothing, and Giannis is smacking people the hell around. So we will see how all that continues. Yeah, there it is. I will be back again tomorrow, probably 40 minutes before lock. Gonna reduce it a little bit as we get into these series. Save everyone some time. But until then, best of luck in your tournaments tonight, and bon chance.